the main thing of Hayek and the rule of law, I would say how it started. It started with a letter by Keynes. Keynes was reading Road of Serfdom in his trip to United States in order to go to Bretton Woods. And apparently, or so the story goes, he wrote to Hayek asking him if he could differentiate between good or bad regulation. Because apparently, Keynes thought that in Road to Serfdom, all regulation was in itself bad. The answer of Hayek was to start writing about the rule of law, first in the constitutional liberty, and then law, liberty, law, legislation, and liberty. Why is law, or at least the rule of law in Hayek, important? First, because he indicated, I think for the first time, the importance of legal institutions for economic performance, which was, I've seen at least, not seriously treated before. Second, his main contribution to legal theory was the creation of law, or the to law as a spontaneous and evolutionary order. In generally, we think of law as a given thing. Some sort of legislator appears in history, or some body creates a body of law that we interpret and we apply and judges apply. Hayek indicated that this was not the case. There was not this figure of the legislator. The law was wider than that, and he had a spontaneous, or I would say better than a spontaneous, a disorganized system of creation. And then it evolved. But it didn't evolve necessarily in changes in legislation. It evolved by different ways, uncontrolled and non-centralized. Then he applied the theory of natural rights. We are going to talk a lot about this, which I feel, and is one of the points of this exposition, that this theory of natural rights does not go against the other theories, like the contractarian theory. Even more, I would say that Hayekian theory is best applied in the social contract theory of the state and law than in natural right theories. Why rule of law is important to economic culture? Well, first, law is a basis of legitimacy. It indicates more or less what legitimate government we have, or which action of some persons is legitimate and which aren't. Then it indicates the scope of state regulation. It regulates the life of persons in a way that we considered, in a way, legitimate or at least acceptable. It is the origin of authority. From monarchies to republics, the origin of authority is in some way regulated. And we have to interpret it in order to know what is the basis of all authority. It indicates the possibilities and limits of change. The possibilities of change, basically, because it's very difficult. And in which limits, because some type of change are unacceptable, or should be unacceptable. And finally, one of the main problems for law, for economics, is what we do in times of crisis, and how we solve some situations that were unexpected. Let's start, I feel, with Hayek's, the type of issues he indicates. First, the question of natural rights. I believe in natural rights because he had this idea of the Rechtsstaat. He was formed, to understand Hayek, I think you have to understand the way as he was formed or educated in 19th century and early 20th century Austria. He was formed in the Germanic School of Jurisprudence. He was a lawyer. He even told me personally he studied law in order to avoid the trenches in the First World War, which I think is false. But in any case, he had a great impression of him. He studied law. He knew Mises in the law school, but he was not one of his teachers because Mises was not a professor. So he was educated in this idea of the Rechtsstaat. So he based the whole legal work in natural rights. What is most interesting is that although it's an important point of starting, it is not in reality a central point. We could evolve the legal theory of Hayek to other legal theories, and his main contributions are still applicable. Well, I mentioned law and instantaneous orders, and then this question of emergencies. We will see that Hayek, I have the impression when I read his legal works, that he writes strictly against one of the most disgusting legal scholars of history, which is Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was an important writer in Germany in the 1920s. He still was important until his death, but of course marred because he became a Nazi in some moment of his life. But he wrote about the problem of emergencies. And the other person he wrote, I feel also in the legal theory, is this idea of Keynes that you could deal with emergencies without considering legal theory at all, or legal principles, or the Constitution. Further. What are the problems with natural rights in Hayek, or in general with natural rights, I feel? First, to have natural rights, you have to have rigidly defined values. It's easy to define values in general terms, if they are applicable to a very complex society. But if you, in this next step of natural rights is when you have a natural law. A natural law, by its own name, is normative. It means you can apply it to someone. And to apply principles of natural law to people who have different values is extremely rigid and difficult. That's why Jürgen Habermas indicates that in modern societies, it is very difficult to agree in values, unless we vote, for example, or we discuss it openly. But that the main link we have in moral matters is basically law, legal solutions. But the other problem natural rights has is it does not define how you change it. If you believe in natural law, in general you feel that it's perennial. Catholic natural law is perennial. You could only change it if you knew new things, but you cannot change the core. If you cannot change the core and society change, it is a bit contradictory with this idea of Hayek that you should, law changes with time. So I will end arguing, as I said, that Hayek theory is better with a proceduralist doctrine or concept of democracy. Now, what is the difference between social contract and natural rights? Well, natural rights are, in a way, existent in a society, and social contract of any type needs an ex-ante agreement, some form of agreement. I will use also the term constitution, that using perhaps the term goes back to Aristotle, or perhaps we could speak a constitutional contract to define it. The other problem with values is the social contract is not based on values, it's based on a procedure. If you have a jurisprudence of values, it indicates that you agree on values and you try to apply them in some way or other. But if you have a jurisprudence of a procedural jurisprudence, it means that you, in reality, what you agree is in a procedure to apply new rules and to create new rules. The main difference between social contract and natural rights is this idea of procedure. You have a procedural concept, or create a method in which you create the rules, solve the rules, and debate, and establish the basis of debate. I said a jurisprudence of precedence. What is a jurisprudence of precedence? It means we debate matters we already debated and keep track of our past debates, but we can change it in new debates. In the case of jurisprudence of values, it's completely different. Germany, for example, applies jurisprudence of values. Why? In 1949, Germany came after 40 years dictatorship. There were no democratic values, and they even have difficulties in creating a constitutional court because they couldn't find 8, I would say, democratic jurists to create it. So they had to change a legal system who was not democratic. So what they said, they created a jurisprudence of values, famously in the Lutte case in 1950, in order to change the whole rule of law for the future. These are the new values, these values can't change, and we have to accept them for the future. But in a modern society and a democratic society, that system would be, in a way, unacceptable. We'd rather have a jurisprudence of procedure, of what I would say, of precedents. Why Hayek accepted natural law so easily? Well, he was trained in the Begriff jurisprudence, that we could translate freely as the jurisprudence of values, of concepts, sorry. In this idea that law is all based in concepts, in different concepts, one of them was the creation of the state of the rule of law. The Rechtsstaat means literally the law of the state, or state of law, state of jurisprudence. But it was not a positive law system, basically because there was no democratic or Republican rule of law when Hayek was studying. So in a way, it was a very soft and general subject that indicated that the whole tradition of basically Roman law would be translated into law and accepted in the everyday system. Carl Schmitt says it was a magic box. You can take anything you want from it, rejecting it. But even the great jurist Hans Kelsen, which was indeed a Democrat, he said it's a pleonasm. If you have a state, you have rules. So imagine something's called the law of the state based on laws, it doesn't mean very much. But basically, I would say, this idea was permeated in a whole doctrine. Hayek accepted the subject, or the name even, Rechtsstaat, in one chapter of Constitutional Liberty. What in reality is Hayek's rule of law? It's a mixture of things. He has a Rechtsstaat, for once, but then he brought Dicey, the name, he took the name rule of law of Dicey, and he was trained in a way in English common law, completely different from the law he had studied. But he thought this idea that law could be different something from legislation. And in a way, in a way correctly, I feel, he indicated that political institutions are instrumental. They don't create the law. They just accept it and in a way indicate indicate the way of the law. He had a negative example. He was very much in disgust with the legal orders of totalitarian states. And when he wrote, there were throughout in Eastern Europe. And especially in the legal institutions that applies regulations. I mean, there was a Soviet law and East German law especially, and they have institutions, and he considered that could not be considered law in the sense of the rule of law. And there is another subject I didn't put in this film, but it comes because of a recent article by Professor Phelps and Professor Bidet in Newsweek, if I'm not mistaken, when they said that why the state is considered differently for lending than individual. Well, that comes from another point, indicated also by Hayek, the difference between public law and private law, an ancient, 2,000-year-old tradition. But this ancient tradition made that the state was ruled differently from the individuals. So we're not all the same. The state is something different. It has a different legal nature. And Hayek indicated against that, and I think modern legal doctrine follows him in that. So many of the problems we have about regulation is about this different nature of the state. Could we apply Hayek to the social contract? Why I indicate this? Because I feel that this natural rights debate in a way weakens Hayek. And I feel he was a great jurist, apart from a great economist. And I feel that the spontaneous development is easier in a social contract scenario. Why? Because we have an ex-ante agreement. We have several easy or basic rules. And then we have a great debate, which indicate that jurisprudence values cannot be evolved. I mentioned the Luth case. Because how we consider a modern law, for example. If we follow Jürgen Habermas, another Kantian, Habermas said the legitimate law is self-applied. It means I have to accept that the rule is applied against me is in a way acceptable. And why it is acceptable? Not because it's monologic, not because it was indicated by one, but it's because it's dialogic. It means there was a debate in which I can participate in a legal court. And in that case, the reason of that rule is debated. And my reasons are going to be considered. So the rule finally applied is someone in which I could have taken part, or at least I could taken part. This idea of the procedure, I feel, is not enough accepted in the natural rights, but yes, in the contract, in social contract. I said a spontaneous order. That is also a very old German tradition. It comes from a jurist that Hayek liked very much, was Friedrich Karl von Savigny. Savigny considered that law really could not be legislated. It was an evolution according to times. He took 2,000 years of Roman jurisprudence applied over the sea and selected it and wrote a famous book, The System of Modern Roman Law. That idea of Savigny is very much similar to, say, the idea of evolution and the spontaneous order. So nobody this is a quotation from Hayek, nobody creates real law, not the judges, not the legislators. It's a process. It's a process and nobody has the deliberate intention of changing the legislation. Hayek, I feel, makes another strange mistake. He distinguished between law and legislation. That part I felt a bit artificial. And I felt that we can have a more monist theory for that. How the judge is applicable in the spontaneous order? In that he has a coincidence with Kelsen. Hayek didn't like Kelsen. Kelsen was a positivist and Hayek was against positivism. They were both Democrats and very strong Democrats in that. They were both obviously against Hitler. Kelsen had to escape from Austria to Switzerland, then the United States, when he ended a professor in the West Coast, someplace, Stanford. But there is one thing that Kelsen indicated I feel applies perfectly with Hayek. We have the abstract norm, which is the general norm that Hayek speaks. But then how it is applied to us? It is applied because the judge transforms that general hypothetical norm into a practical individual norm that is applied to someone or something. That transformation is what Hayek looked when he was thinking of a spontaneous order. Because let's say, a constitutional norm, it means very little. It's a very, very vast, generic term. It has to be transformed after a debate between the parties and the judge into a new norm with new foundations. And these foundations are the evolution of the law that Hayek indicated, and also the idea of the spontaneous creation of the new law. So the transformation demonstrates evolution and process of law in the creation of, I hope I'm good with time. I will hate to put my friend Amar in a difficult situation. There was another problem with Hayek. vision of law, the time he was living in, as it with all of us. First, Europeans didn't believe that constitutions were law. That sounds unbelievable now, but it was not unbelievable in 1960. Judges didn't apply the Constitution. Couldn't. Today, judges can't apply the Constitution in Europe, with the exception of Switzerland. Only a special tribunal can do it. So this idea that the Constitution was not really part of the law. And the other problem. Some constitutions, in some places in Europe, but also in Latin America, had this enormous amount of social rights. And Hayek was a bit afraid that if we, in a way, accept the Constitution as part of the rule of law that he was thinking of, it could be a source of social rights which he considered not very reasonable, which I spare you of the debate. So he had this distrust, which I feel didn't give the complete idea. But now let's go to the main point of this conversation. What happened with crisis? When you have a crisis, the rule of law is challenged. Basically, we have two problems to solve. First, who should make decisions? Great debate in Germany during Hayek. There was a very known book, not great, but very known book by Carl Schmitt called The Hüter der Verfassung. It was called The Custodian of the Constitution, which indicated that in reality, when there was a crisis, there was no law. And only the president had the power to bring the law back. The other one, this other problem is who is a person who has the power? Does he have a deference from other powers to take extra-legal solutions, or he has to abide to law? He has the power, but has to abide to the rule of law, or he can take extra-legal solutions. And this is a problem which I think starts with us today. First problem, first thing, law presumes certainty. So the rule of law is something unexpected. I mentioned the Keynesian Constitution. Keynes wrote Articles 23 and 24, the euthanasia, the rentier, and all that. He, in a way, ignores the rule of law. He gives some solutions. The rule of law is non-existent. Of course, for Carl Schmitt, he knew very well. He says the sovereign is who decides exception. In reality, you are sovereign if you can decide an exception, because the necessity has no law. I will spend Carl Schmitt, which is not very agreeable. Hayek, on the contrary, believed in limited government all the time, including crisis. And I felt that the best Hayekian solution given to crisis was mentioned by Professor John Taylor a year ago in this same, not same room, but same place. In this idea that in case of crisis or emergencies, you shouldn't run to discretion, to authorities, or run to accept special rules. But the rationale is basically you have to accept the existing rules and run the crisis within rules, not rigid rules, because in the end, the existence of rules is what lowers the uncertainty during a crisis. On the contrary, the recognition of political discretion to authorities, it only brings more uncertainty and more insecurity.